Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you as part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and distributed live stream. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Simeon Morrow and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please turn off your camera and microphone and/or go to the Facebook Live video feed, the link to which I will now place in the chat room. For a better experience, please turn off your microphone and set your video to gallery view. Tonight, our featured guests are William Deresiewicz, an award-winning essayist and critic, and Jonathan Zimmerman, an education historian. We are also pleased to be joined by Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California. Tonight, two books will be presented: William Deresiewicz Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite, and The Way to a Meaningful Life, and Jonathan Zimmerman's The Amateur Hour, A History of College Teaching in America. Each author will make a brief presentation, which will then be responded to by the other author. After their presentations and responses, it is our hope that all participants will join in the discussion and ask many questions and make many comments. Bill, welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, Simeon, for making this happen, John, for joining me, everyone else.
A pleasure. Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Bill?
Oh, there's so little to tell, really. I mean, I'm an ex-academic who has been a full-time writer since 2008. I was an English professor at Yale. Well, let me just sort of launch in, because this is part of, telling you about that is part of telling you about the book. Because the book grew directly out of my experiences as a Yale professor for 10 years. And I also taught as a graduate instructor at Columbia for 5 years before that. And the book grew very organically out of what I was hearing, and maybe even more importantly, what I was seeing among my students. I was the kind of professor who really liked to get to know his students, which is unfortunately unusual, and took the time to listen to them and ask them about their lives, but more importantly, make myself available for them to say to me what they need to say. And I think the best way to summarize what the book is about is to unpack the title, Excellent Sheep, which is a wonderful phrase that I can't take credit for. It sort of popped out of the mouth of one of my students during seminar at a moment of kind of startled collective self-recognition. She said, "Are you saying that we're all just kind of like excellent sheep?" I wasn't exactly saying that, but she sort of got that was kind of implicit in the conversation we were having. So what does it mean to be an excellent sheep? Well, students at elite American colleges and universities, and I mean much more than just Ivy League institutions like Yale or University of Pennsylvania, where John teaches, but at least 100 schools, highly selective schools. And let me anticipate something I'm going to say later and say, this is by no means confined to American institutions of higher education. Students at those places are undoubtedly excellent in terms of how we define that word now, which means that they're great at meeting the kinds of educational benchmarks and later really career benchmarks that we expect from so-called high achievers. They're very smart, they're very hardworking, they're very driven and ambitious, but they're also, in my students' word, sheep, meaning that they lack an ability to engage in self-direction, self-reflection and self-direction, and the self-reflection that self-direction comes out of. I saw my students either rushing off like sheep to pursue one of four prestige careers: law, medicine, finance, and consulting. Today, I would also include tech. So of all the things that these marvelously credentialed and highly capable young people could do in the world, they literally a sizable majority, did or do one of 4 or 5 things. Either that, or the ones, typically the ones that were a little more self-reflective and more idealistic, often drifted, didn't know what they wanted to do as they went through college, got out of college. They would stay in touch with me, and sometimes this went on for years. The one thing that I didn't know, but learned later, was that all of this was also making them quite miserable. In other words, the whole system that I'm describing, because the two elements, the excellence and the sheephood, are connected, and they grow out of the fundamental structure of elite education now, which pivots on the admissions process to elite colleges and universities, which has grown more and more demanding, more and more, people talk about a credentials arms race, more and more advanced courses, extracurricular activities, sports, music, foreign travel, service, which is a sort of performance of humanitarianism, leadership, whatever that means, and so forth. So extreme has this become that students start running to pursue this goal of elite college admissions in what we here call junior high school or middle school at age 12, 13, but really earlier, really sometimes 10, 8, even 6. They're like miniature adults. They're miniature sort of high achieving adults. And as a result, they never have time to develop the kind of inner self and inner strength that would enable them to figure out who they are and what they want. They become consummate hoop jumpers. What David Brooks, who wrote about this before me and maybe before anybody else, calls achievement machines. They are great at giving the grown-ups what the grown-ups want, which means that when it comes time to figure out what they want, basically when the hoops run out during college, right? You got into college, now what's next? They run around for new hoops to look to jump through, or they don't know what they want to do. So the book is about this, and it's about the consequences of this, both for students themselves and for society as a whole, because these society as a whole, in the sense that these elite institutions are the training grounds, are the production factories for our leadership class, for what we call the meritocracy. And indeed, the more I thought about my students and I thought about the failures of our leadership class, this is now, in the wake of the Iraq War and then the financial collapse and so many other things since then, I realized that the characteristics of our leadership class are the same as the characteristics of my students. It is full of people who are driven by a kind of contentless ambition and loyal to nothing but their own advancement. You can think about somebody like Bill Clinton, but so many other people as well. Corporate leaders, academic leaders, politicians, and so forth. And finally, this is, as I said before, this is not just the United States. The big thing that I learned after the book came out in 2014 was that what I described, first of all, was true of students well below the elite level in this country, lots of colleges and universities, and that it wasn't just true in the United States. I mean, I heard from people across Europe, across the developing world, East Asia, South America, South Asia, and so forth. So I think this is a global phenomenon and a problem for all of us, and not just these kids.
Okay. So before I introduce and welcome John, I would like to bring in Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California to comment a question. Hi, Lino.
Hello, Simeon, and hello, Bill.
Right.
it's very fascinating. I am a professor myself of music here at St. Mary's College of California in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I can relate to what you have just said. Now, my question is, how did we get there? How did we get here? In other words, there was there was no king who proclaimed that we should be doing this to our kids. Uh, how did it develop? And do you
Yes.
know?
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh, yes, yes, yes. I have a whole chapter in the book on the history. It wasn't a king, but coincidentally enough, it was a guy named Kingman Brewster. Not him only. Basically, this was the story. Up until about the 1960s, these elite American institutions were exclusive clubs that restricted membership to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male upper class, right? Products of the New England boarding schools. There were exceptions, but fundamentally this was the case. For example, at Yale, there was an unofficial quota. At many schools, there was an unofficial maximum quota of Jews. At Yale, it was 10%. At Princeton, it was 3%. Stanford, some of the New England colleges, like I believe Williams and others. And they were all male institutions. There were few or no African-American students, okay? Sometimes Princeton would have one African-American student in its college, as late as the 50s. So by the 1960s, there was an increasingly widespread recognition that the situation was untenable. There needed to be a fundamental change in how these colleges admitted students. And the change was led by a president of Yale named Kingman Brewster. The name suggests that he was an old school white Anglo-Saxon Protestant aristocrat, but he initiated this change to a substantially different admissions system that we would call meritocratic. So it was based not on character and where you went to school, but SAT scores, high school GPA, and those kinds of, and the school became co-ed, affirmative action, and so forth. Great. This was a really substantial and progressive social change that opened up the American elite to other groups. However, very quickly, and that was mid-60s. By the early 70s, upper middle class and upper class families had started to figure out how to game this system, how to make it work for themselves. Basically, by investing more and more in their students' education, sending them to private schools or moving to suburbs with affluent suburbs with great public schools, and then test prep and tutors and high school, youth sports leagues and foreign travel and all the stuff, right? This all takes money. And like I said, so basically you're producing merit, but you're producing merit by paying for it. It's been said that the college admissions process has become a way of laundering privilege. And like I said, it's become an arms race. I mean, I went through it in the early 80s when the numbers were, maybe 3 advanced courses that you needed to get into an Ivy League school. And by now it's like 13. It's just feeding on itself more and more. Does that make sense?
Yes, fascinating, Bill. I mean, this is the first time I'm hearing all of this, and I'm seeing all of this because even high school and middle school students are really gearing up towards this, and I see this in my students all the time.
Yes, I should say that I didn't do the work. The great book about this is called The Chosen by, I think he's at Berkeley, Jerome Carabel.
Yeah.
So if you want to know all about this, you can read that book, The Chosen.
So thank you, Bill. John, welcome.
Thank you.
So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and then maybe give a response to what Bill said?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. First of all, it's a huge honor to be here with Bill Deresiewicz. I teach a course called Why College? Historical Perspectives, a freshman seminar. And for the past couple of years, Bill has joined it at the end of the term via Zoom, and he's going to do the same this term. And it's always the highlight of the semester. He's taught me and my students more about these subjects than literally anybody that I know. I'm a historian of American schools and universities, and I've spent most of my career studying what people want these institutions to do and be and how they've clashed over that. So I've written books about sex education, about history education, religion instruction, the Little Red Schoolhouse in history and memory. And the book I'm talking about now was, or I'm going to be talking about, was a little bit of a diversion from that, because it was more of, I think, an institutional history, really looking at how college teaching has worked or not over the past 100 years or so. With respect to what Bill just said, you know, I'm so profoundly in agreement with this perspective that it's hard to frame critical questions, but I do think there's an important one lurking in there, which I think Vladimir Lenin would say, what is to be done? You know, I don't disagree with Bill's analysis. In fact, I strongly agree with it. But I also wonder if it's just too overdetermined, in the sense that, you know, you finish his book and you feel like these kids are kind of in this deterministic maw, you know, just sort of in the jaws of this machine. And I guess my question to him, especially because he's kept in contact with so many of the students that he worked with, is, you know, if Bill Deresiewicz became the dean of Yale, which by the way is not going to happen, all right, what would he do? That is what specifically can we as educators do to alleviate some of the horror show that he documents in his book?
Well, first of all, I'm going to ask you the same question once you've presented your book, but I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer. I'm sort of going to duck your question, but I'm going to answer it this way. I agree that this feels deterministic and it feels like a machine or a system. I use both of those words. A system in the sense of a set of tightly interlocking parts where everyone, no matter what node they are, is acting out of the incentives created by the forces that are acting on them. So the students, the parents, the high schools, which play a very important part, the high school teachers, the universities. So no one seems to have much freedom, right? I think the actor that has the most degrees of freedom, as my father, the engineer, would have said, is the student. Because they don't have children to feed yet. They don't have trustees to please, like a college president. They can't do whatever they want, and especially as the economy gets harsher and harsher, they certainly can't, but they have a lot of room to rethink what they're doing and to do it differently. And that's the main reason I wrote the book. It's for the students, it's for the college student who feels themselves to be miserable and wants a different option. And I'm telling them, first of all, you're not alone. Many people feel this way. Second of all, you have options. But, and this is this is the really important thing. It's going to be a trade-off. I don't pretend that you can step off of this conveyor belt that leads to status and wealth and not have to end up giving up some degree of status and wealth. But you can, but it could be for the sake of living a life that feels like the right life for you to live. That's how I put it now. I don't want to talk about pursuing your passion. It's just it becomes such a cliche, but is this the life that I should be living? Does this feel right to me? Do I feel fulfilled? Do I feel like I'm doing what I should be doing in the world and for the world? So it's a trade-off, but recognize that it's already a trade-off, right? Because if you stay on the conveyor belt, you're not going to feel any less miserable. You're just going to continue to be a hoop jumping meritocrat like the adults that you see around you if you really look and see what's going on.
And Bill, with respect to, no, go ahead,
Okay.
Sorry.
So the individual level, and then my last two chapters, the largest level, because I think fundamentally this is about inequality and inequality in the economy as a whole that drives people into these choices, and inequality in higher education, the way we have defunded our great systems of public higher education. That's a huge lift. free college, reversing inequality. The reason I ducked the dean question is that, quite frankly, I feel like those people don't really have much freedom at all to change what they're doing.
Mm.
I mean, they can make the same choice that a student makes and do things completely differently and become poorer. But they're not going to do that. I'd like them to do that, but they're not. And if they did, most of these students would just go somewhere else. I mean, if Harvard reinvented itself as Reed College or Bard College, which are two schools that have struggled financially, but really are rigorous and create, well, then Harvard students wouldn't keep going to Harvard. They would just go somewhere else.
Right. And Bill, with respect to the so-called misery piece and the emphasis you put on kind of the mental health crises in these populations, I was looking your book again this morning, and one question that I haven't asked you before that occurred to me this time is when you consider how widespread mental health problems are now in the so-called iPhone generation. It's been documented by people like Jean Twenge. Isn't it possible that people like you and me might be exaggerating the differential effect of these institutions? Like, not to deny the mental health crisis, but it seems to be so much more generational and so much more widespread than kids at elite schools. Maybe we're putting too much of an accent on the institutions and not enough on this sort of broader cultural frame.
No, and here's why. So again, to say the institutions is I would say the system, the process, right? The admissions process and the whole credential. The reason I say no, it's not the iPhone, is that it preceded the iPhone. Yeah. People started writing about this in the 90s. People started sounding the alarm, and I wasn't aware of it yet. No question, it's gotten much worse because of the iPhone, but it's documented. I mean, I think Jean Twenge sort of dates this change to around the time that I was writing the book. Yeah. In other words, it was only just starting when I was writing the book, and all the observations the book is based on had already happened.
Right. No, I think that's a compelling answer. And obviously the technologies exacerbated and changed things in various ways, but didn't invent them. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's hear about your book.
Yeah. Very briefly, let's get a couple things out of the way, because I've taken so much for the title of the book, The Amateur Hour. Amateur doesn't mean bad. So the greatest gymnast of my youth was Nadia Comaneci, and she was an amateur because back then all Olympians were. Amateur doesn't refer to good or bad. It refers to the way that a society or even a system approaches a given practice. And what my book tries to show is that teaching remains an amateur practice in higher education, not because it's bad, because sometimes it's very good, but because we don't have systems to professionalize it. We don't have shared understandings of what would be good or bad. And most of all, we don't have structures that try to promote the good and inhibit the bad. I realized this actually when, ironically, I received at my prior institution, NYU, the University-wide Teaching Award, which was a tremendous honor, and still, I think, the highest honor that I've received. Both my parents were there, and my dad passed away recently, and I thought about him at that event because there was a huge Nacus thing for him as well. And if you're ethnically challenged, Nacus just means like huge pride in your offspring. And my dean gets up to introduce me, and I look at the lectern, and I looked at her notes, and her notes are the books I had written. So just think about this, right? I'm getting honored for this teaching award, and the dean gets up and says, and then he wrote the following title, and then he wrote the following title. But in fairness to her, and I liked the dean, there was nothing wrong with the dean, in fairness to her, what else did she have to go on? She had never been to my class, and even if she had, maybe once, what would that indicate to her about my professional capacities or skills in that function? I don't think it would indicate anything. And so she was flying by the seat of her pants. And I think in a way, all of us are on this subject. So the other story I begin the book with is what really inspired it was attending this debate about online instruction, maybe 5-6 years ago, where basically there was somebody from the futurist camp and somebody from the Luddite camp, to be bold about it. And the futurist was saying this is going to make everything better, and the Luddite was saying it's going to make everything worse. At the end of the debate, I found myself very unsatisfied because weirdly, they actually were coming from the same place. They both thought they knew what the baseline was, right? If you want to say that everything's going to be better or everything's going to be worse, you need some sort of shared understanding of what everything is. And we don't have it. Really why I wrote the book at the end of the day was to try to provide that kind of baseline. That is to try to tell a story of what teaching has been up until now, so the rest of us can decide what we want it to be. The big surprise in doing the book was actually how much reform has been attempted of college teaching, and most of all, how much student protest there's been around it. Not in very recent years, by the way, in the dim past. Let's just get this out of the way. I don't know if anybody's seen The Chair, the show on Netflix. Bill, have you watched it? Have you watched The Chair? Yeah. This is not a spoiler alert, but it turns on this college professor who, in an ironic way, for a half second, does a Hitler salute. It's obviously ironic if you watch it in its context, but it creates this huge kerfuffle on campus, and students are protesting this. We should fire this guy. And the fact that this professor was a drunk and a drug addict and totally mailing in his class to the point of not knowing the title of the class before he gets to class, this doesn't exercise the students at all. In fact, it doesn't even come up. The TA is a little upset about this. He's a PhD student. But the rest of the students, it's almost like they expect it or don't care. Well, what's interesting about that, and really what I would like students to take away from the book, is actually the long record of student protest around this that we've forgotten, that precedes them by about 100 years. It begins in the 1920s, and the reason for that is it's in the 20s that the universities suddenly get huge. And the big reasons for that are A, it's a time of prosperity, and B, women are going, like in huge numbers. And so the first time, if you read the Michigan Daily at the University of Michigan, you find people writing, so I went to this class in a classroom that was built for 90 students. There were 300 students. They were sitting in the aisle. There was a dude up front mumbling into a microphone that didn't work. Why am I here? And it was in that time that the students created student evaluations. They were not created by institutions. The institutions later adapted them and, in my reading, in some ways perverted them. But they were actually an element of this same protest. They were created by students to try to highlight how inadequate so much of their teaching was. When we get to the Cold War, especially the late 40s and early 50s, we see a similar dynamic that is both growth and protest. That growth is fueled by the GI Bill. And, even after reading 10 books about the GI Bill, I still feel like we need 10 more, because you can't exaggerate its effect on American higher ed. You got to get this. By 1947, half of undergrads are vets. So that's 2 years after. It's unbelievable. And you think of just the density of change in that moment. And these GIs, like, they came home and got a degree in a house and a wife and a baby in a week and a half. I mean, not exactly, but close to it. And at places like the University of Minnesota, they had Veterans Village, and Wisconsin had fertile acres, because they also built housing for these guys, and let's just say they came home eager for female companionship, and they had babies extremely quickly. But the other thing they did was, they complained about bad teaching. Like, these are guys, they fought at Guadalcanal and the Battle of the Bulge, and they come home and they're exposed again to this mumbler, who's filling up a blackboard. Sometimes, this is my favorite, the dimensions of ancient buildings. So the art history teacher would have people memorize to the meter, the dimensions of the Parthenon. Oh, great. Or chemistry teachers making people memorize boiling points, again, and the GIs are like, no. This isn't what we signed up for. This isn't what we want. And then, of course, in the 1960s, something I think is really interesting about the way we remember student protests in the 60s, of course, we remember civil rights protests and we remember, right, anti-war protests. But we tend to forget that figures like Tom Hayden and Mario Savio also protested poor teaching. Even if you look at the Port Huron statement, which was, Hayden's sort of now iconic statement, there's a lot in that about bad teaching. Hayden says, a lot of this teaching is irrelevant, static, alienating to us, irrelevant to us and what we're thinking about. In part because, these professors have essentially become kind of tools of corporations and big government. They're going for the gold, which is research dollars, and they're neglecting us. And you see this in Mario Savio's rhetoric about Berkeley being like a machine as well. Do not fold, bend, and mutilate. I'm a human being, not an IBM card. And that's the story I tell in the book, this protest and some reforms that came out of it. So in the 1920s, you have tutorials, you have comprehensive exam systems. In the 1950s, you have the growth of smaller seminars. You see something like that in the 1960s too. At the same time, you see the invoking of technology. Ironically, I would argue, to make things more personal. And surely television did make things more personal in the sense that you could flip on the TV whenever you wanted. In the same time, you could flip on your laptop. But at the same time, of course, it made it radically more impersonal as well. And lots of these protests have pointed that out too. So, I think we've got actually a much better consensus now on what good teaching is. There's a guy at Temple, actually, whose name is David Glubar, who's written this book called The Missing Course, which I think is the best synopsis of what we've learned about college teaching. And I think there's been much better research about it in the past, say, 20 years. But the title is illuminating. It's the missing course because even though we've amassed this new knowledge, nobody really has to learn it. It's the missing course because professors don't take that course. So we have more knowledge about what good teaching is, but what we don't have, and this gets back to the title of the book, is really a set of systems and a set of institutional commitments to make sure that we know that literature, but most of all, that we behave in accord with it.
Bill, your response?
Yeah, John, thank you so much for this book. I have been, without knowing that you were writing it, I've been waiting for this book because I was very committed to teaching as a professor. It's one of the reasons I'm no longer a professor, because I didn't focus single-mindedly on research before I got tenure, which I never got. And I continue to care deeply about teaching. I feel like once you're a teacher, you're always a teacher. But I've wanted to understand the history. Where did the things that I value come from? When did people start doing Socratic teaching? Where did the seminar come from? But also just generally, to my chagrin, I learned that the things that I've been complaining about as phenomena of the last 20 years or so, you've got a chapter or two on each period, and it's the same problems in different terms. TV technology, and then of course in the 21st century we have the MOOCs, we have online learning, teaching being neglected because of research, reform efforts that fail, et cetera, et cetera. God, I don't even know where to start. I will say, I noticed and I was struck by the fact that there was student protest over teaching, which I didn't realize, as you just outlined. And I didn't realize it because there really hasn't been in the last 2 decades. And I think that that's really quite significant. I will say, I can ask a question, but I think we can also just do this as a conversation. Something very interesting has happened. Since I read your book, I read another book by a friend of mine who started a very successful charter school system called Harlem Village Academies. She's gotten amazing results from very low-income students. She's not cherry picking her students. And the book, the central thrust of the book is that if you want students to learn, you have to support teachers and you have to create an environment in which teachers can become better teachers by working on teaching together. Teachers, master teachers observe less experienced teachers in her schools. Teachers work on lesson plans together. Teachers are constantly brainstorming solutions to disciplinary problems, instructional problems, whatever. Why do I say all this? Because as John knows, one of the central thrusts of his book is that consistently people have said about college teaching, it's a matter of personality. Either you got it or you haven't. There's really nothing you can do to make a teacher, a good teacher or a poor teacher better or a mediocre teacher better. On top of which, no one has time for this. There was actually a wonderful group of graduate students at Yale while I was in the English department who started something called Working at Teaching through the Graduate Center, where they independently decided, hey, we're teachers, we're going to be teachers, we're not going to probably have Ivy League appointments after this. We need to work at teaching. But it was completely a grad school, self-started, nobody cared. And the grad students who thought they were going to be Ivy League teachers wanted nothing to do with it. So I guess if I'm going to frame a question, and I'm sorry to ask a predictable one, do you think that we can do something really to raise the level of college teaching in America?
You know, I actually believe that we can. You know, I didn't when I was working on the book. But one of the things that's been really just exciting to me that's happened since the book is I've discovered more about contemporary efforts at reform. You know, I'm a historian, so I'm not very good about living people. You know, I'm mostly a dead people guy, you know, but after my book came out, you've probably seen there's this organization called the American Council for Undergraduate Education, ACU. And it's not that many people know about it yet, but it's actually a fabulous story. It was started by this guy named Giorco, who went to Teachers College and got a PhD and realized that all the things he learned at Teachers College about teaching were being ignored or flouted in higher ed, and got a bunch of foundations to help him create this organization. It's still quite nascent. It's only about 5 years old. But what they do is they develop trainings and they create certificate programs where, you know, college professors can earn this credential, showing that this organization has prepared them to some degree for this enterprise. And again, it's all very new. I think about 15,000 people have earned these certificates. Obviously, we have several million college teachers, but you have to start somewhere. And I think the premise is actually quite simple, which is that, you know, if we're going to change this, it has to be at the organizational level. Like there do have to be things like certificates. There have to be little goodies in there. You know, you can't run a railroad based on people's goodwill. You know, that's just not the way these things work. You have to change incentive structures. And the ones we have now for good teaching are mostly a joke. Even, you know, so-called teacher observation. I mean, I have a friend who made this really great analogy. He said, most of what we call like teacher evaluation in higher ed, it would be as if somebody evaluating me as a historian followed me for a day to an archive and watched me, and then wrote a report afterwards. You know, Zimmerman requested many boxes, you know, and he took many notes on his laptop. And I think most people would understand that that wouldn't represent a very good evaluation of what I did, because it's a snapshot and not necessarily a relevant one. So really what these organizations like AQ are pointing us to, I think, is peer review of teaching. That's what we need. You know, when I wrote my book on college teaching, I didn't submit it to a bunch of students who knew nothing about the subject to evaluate it. Which is what student evaluation is, right? That's what we do with our teaching. I submitted it to other people that actually know something about the subject and were qualified to tell me if I was saying anything worthwhile. On the student evaluation side, just for the listeners, I mean, I'm sure Bill knows this, but just to be clear, I'm a big supporter of student evaluations because I think they can tell us some important things. They can tell us, for example, if the professor returns work on time, which turns out to be hugely important to students' learning. They can tell us if the professor makes herself or himself available outside of class, which is also very important. What they can't tell us if it's an academically credible or useful class. And the reason is the students don't know enough. Just like I couldn't do that for a physics class. I could go to a physics class and observe a couple things that may be of import, but I couldn't tell if it was a good physics class because I don't know enough about physics. And so I think that's the direction that we need to go in. And I think there are little glimmers of it.
Again, I have so much to say, but I want to defer to our audience because, you know, we have 20 minutes, which is still a decent amount of time. And if there are questions, I want to give them a chance for either of us.
Wonderful. So why don't we then open it up, like Bill says, to any questions that anybody would have. I'm sure Professor Lino Rivera has several for us. In the meantime, then, why don't I start us off with a question of my own. One, it's to both of you. I'd like to start with Bill, because Bill, it seems that the most praise you give any school, and you don't give very much praise to schools in your books, but the most praise you give seems to be Lawrence University in Wisconsin. And you say that they really have a liberal arts curriculum that's dedicated to student learning. And so that kind of got me thinking generally about both of your books, and that you seem to say that if you want learning, you go to a community college. What you don't mention also are prep schools. And it seems like this kind of student attention might be gotten at a prep school in a place where there's no research going on. Bill?
I think, with respect, I think you may be unfamiliar with some of the terms we use in the United States. Prep schools are high schools, they're secondary schools, they're sort of fancy secondary schools. Community colleges are 2-year schools that give you an associate degree and then prepare you to complete your bachelor's degree at a 4-year institution. Lawrence University is not that. Lawrence is an example of a school that I like. I like specifically their first-year core course. There are a number of schools in the book and a number of kinds of schools that I have good things to say about. I think different kinds of schools have different strengths. At the time I wrote the book, before political correctness, or what we now call wokeness, completely took over the American Academy, and especially the liberal arts colleges, which means standalone 4-year institutions that tend to be extremely liberal in the other sense. I reserved my most substantial praise for liberal arts colleges, 4-year institutions, rather than larger research universities, precisely because they tend to focus on teaching more, to value teaching more, and also still retain a greater commitment to what we call the liberal arts, which means the core disciplines of the humanities, the social sciences, and even the sciences, all of which are liberal arts, as opposed to vocational or professional subjects like business or nursing or communications, which the majority of American college students now major in. So I think but also I would say that within each institutional type, different institutions do things differently. I don't know how relevant this is for our audience, but when I give advice to parents or high school students about what college to think about, I say, you know, colleges are different and you need to look at specific institutions. It's one of the strengths of the American system that there's a great diversity, but the important thing for me is that teaching is supported, that the liberal arts are valued. I would be interested to know how much of this applies beyond the United States, but I suspect a lot of what we've been talking about has. As I said about my thing, and I think about John's thing, because it's the same incentive structure that favors research rather than teaching. I assume that it's the same problem of teaching as a unsupervised, unprofessionalized activity. I also think there's a lot of conversation between our two subjects, right? I mean, to me, one of the key, probably the most important person who's going to help students, who's going to help rescue students from this conveyor belt, is the teacher who takes a personal interest in them and in their growth and development. A mentor.
John,
I mean,
so, yes.
I just met with my first year, with my first year class, the one that Bill would meet with at the end of the semester for the first time last week. And I just said to them, listen, chill, you already won. Like, you already won the Hunger Games. Penn accepted 6% of its applicants last year. You won. So game over. You know, now it's time to figure out what you really want to do. You know, you won that game. But I don't know how much of this got through, because so much of the other markers at the same time, by the way, this was also club day, where all the clubs outside are recruiting people. And over half of those clubs, you have to compete to get into. So what does that teach students? I mean, just think about that. I mean, I wrote about this a few years ago when a student of mine told me that she had applied to be in the Alzheimer's Buddies Club and hadn't gotten in. The Alzheimer's Buddies Club, you know, they get a van and they go to a hospital and they visit Alzheimer's patients. And I said, hold on, time out. You didn't get in? What was the process for getting in? Well, of course, you had to write an essay about all your sort of munificent motives for visiting Alzheimer's patients. But even worse, perhaps, you had to have an interview with one of the officers in the club, you know, like, again, some pisher like in a skirt and a tie who's going to interview you. And I said, look, it's a free country. My students are full citizens. They can vote in elections. They die in wars. If they want to create a little club and make their interviews and all that, they can do that. But if they want, like, the university's imprimatur and its shekel and its money, no, we're not going to do that. And if there are only 12 seats in the van and 18 people want to do it, we'll just randomize.
Get it. Or get another van.
Or get another van, right? One of the two. And I put that to my students, and here, this is the awful takeaway. And we're going to go very dark here. Here's what they said. They read the column and they said, well, professor, then nobody would want to do the Alzheimer's Buddies Club. And that's so dark, you can't even think about it. At least I can't. Because of course it vitiates all that munificent stuff they're writing about in the essay, right? There's nothing about altruism here. There's nothing about service here. That which is competitive is valuable, and that which isn't is not.
So,
like, full stop. End of story. And that's twisted. I can't think of any other word that I can say in public.
So
Because this is
John, he mentioned something that you mentioned in your book about congratulating the students at the beginning of the year as if they're great. And you mentioned how in the 1920s or 50s, I can't remember when, that the teachers or the dean dressed down the students and said, we could have had anybody in here that's much better than you, but we chose you, so you better make use of this time. So what's your response?
I mean, I think there are a lot of things going on here. One of them, and this goes back to Bill's comments about meritocracy, right? I think one of the things that's so twisted about our current moment is we miseducate people into thinking that they earned everything that they have. And the other thing I do in my first day is I say, look, I've got 2 young adult daughters. They went to fancy private schools. I know the gauntlet you ran, and I know how hard you worked. And I admire that. And I do, by the way, but you also had a lot of benefits along the way that you did not earn, right? That all have to do with the situation of your birth. And I think in the pre-meritocratic era, everyone understood that. The other thing I give my students is JFK's Harvard application, which, thanks to the genius of the Kennedy Library and the internet, you can Google and read. Bill, have you ever done this? It's so up your alley. You should do it after the webinar.
Tell me about it.
He writes his essay in hand. And it's, of course, why do you want to go to Harvard? And what he writes in hand is, well, my dad went here and I've always wanted to be a Harvard man. Yeah. And it's amazing because, of course, this wouldn't explain why Joseph P. sent him to Princeton for his first year. He got ill and had to drop out. It's like, dude, if you always wanted to be a Harvard man, why did you go to Princeton, right? But more than that, in the file is a letter from Joseph P., his dad, right? I mean, obviously, had been the ambassador of Britain, Security Exchange Commission, hugely successful alcohol bootlegger. And Joseph P. writes in his notes, says, listen, Jack has never really applied himself very well. And when he gets to Harvard, I really hope that you'll help him get his act together. So talking about privilege, right? Whether he's getting in or not is a fait accompli. But when he gets in, will you help him get his act together? And, you know, it's interesting. I show this to the students and they're like, this guy would never get in now. And that is true. Even if he was a Kennedy, right? Even a Kennedy with that package wouldn't get in. But I think the larger point is that, first of all, that Kennedy today would be coached in all the different ways Bill has described to make this happen.
Exactly.
But given JFK's milieu, JFK was under no illusion that he had earned his way to Harvard. In fact, he knew that he hadn't. And really, that's what the application shows, right? He hadn't earned his way, but he knew that, and his dad knew that. And what that did is, you know, that in the minds of that sensibility, right, of that era, it gave him this obligation to serve, precisely because he knew how much had been given to him. If you come in today believing that you've earned every single thing you have, why should you give anything to anybody else? Like, that, let them fight it out the way you did. Like, buddy, you want what I have? Just work for it, you know, just like I did.
Right.
And that's a different sensibility. Now, the Kennedy system wasn't all peaches and cream. First of all, people with names like Deresiewicz and Zimmerman were generally not invited, you know, as Bill said earlier, right? That's no great way to run a railroad either. I think there's a little bit of danger in sort of idealizing this noblesse oblige stuff because not everyone had it, right? But the Kennedys absolutely did. And I can tell you, just to be totally transparent, I am a product of this in every which way. Believe it or not, my father met JFK incidentally on the beach in Marseille in 1956 with his law school roommate, Richard Ravitch, who was later the head of the MTA and mayoral wannabe. And JFK's message to them was he like swam out to the dock with them and hung out with them. And he said, like, listen, you guys, you go to Yale Law School. Most of the people in your class are going to go off to these white shoe law firms, insofar as those firms are hiring people with names like Ravitch and Zimmerman. But you shouldn't. You should go to Washington, because Washington is where the action is going to be. And this could be another planet, right? I mean, at a time when both parties just compete to heap refuse on Washington. Who likes Washington or Congress? I mean, I read Congress's approval rating is 8%. That sounded high to me. Like, who's in the 8%? Like guys who work on the Hill? Like, even people in Congress hate Congress. So it's a different world. But what Kennedy was saying, that's what the action is going to be. You should devote yourself to government and to service. Not to like making money at this Wall Street law firm. And that's what my dad did. He joined the Peace Corps, and that's why I joined the Peace Corps. So I am absolutely a legacy of all this.
I mean, one of the things to note about the 5 professions that most Ivy Leaguers go into is that none of them is what the professions that Ivy Leaguers of Kennedy's day or FDR's day, government service, the foreign service, the CIA, sort of the institutional, the sort of foundation world. I mean, that's where they would have gone.
Journalism.
Because they had, what's that?
Journalism as well.
Journalism as well, absolutely. Because they had this sense of stewardship. You know, the logic of the meritocracy is not just that you've earned it, but also you're doing everything for yourself. I mean, in my book, my leading example of this kind of clueless entitlement was the head of BP. This was right after a few years after that giant oil spill in the Gulf. Who's like, you know, I want my life back too. It's like, this is not about your life. This is not about whether you can go golfing at your second home. And this is, you know, and of course he was British. So this is partly why I strongly suspect that much of this is true in Europe as well.
May I ask, Lino Rivera has another question. Can I bring him in? Hi, Lino.
Of course.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Very fascinating conversation here, gentlemen. I have actually 2 questions. Number one is, you mentioned earlier, both of you, I think it was Bill who was mentioning this, about trying to teach better. And I would like to know what the definition of better is. We always strive to teach better, but where is the point of starting point, and where is the end point? What is that better? And the second question I have is that missing course book. which is related to the first question. What is that missing thing? Do we know that missing factor in order for us to teach better?
I think, I'll let you be the judge of it, but I do think that what had been a very backwater field, i.e. the research about college teaching, I think has become more robust. And I think the Gublar book shows that. And if I were to summarize in just 30 seconds what it shows about what good teaching is teaching that engages students in activities that are specific to disciplines. That's what good teaching is. So a good history course engages students in the activities that historians do. Historians collect sources, try to analyze them, ask different questions about them, compare primary and secondary accounts. The best history teaching engages students in what historians do and engages them in discipline-specific activities that are like what somebody in the profession does. Dr. Rivera is a music professor. I don't know what kind of music he teaches, if it's music theory or music history, but my strong guess.
All of the above.
All of the above, yes, yes. And so, I would expect that if Dr. Rivera is a good teacher of these things, that what he does is he requires his students to do similar things that he does as a music scholar, and because I know so little about music, I can't even identify what those things are, but I'm sure that Dr. Rivera can.
Yeah, and by the way, my friend at Harlem Village Academies, pedagogically, and again, underserved, fifth graders who come in 4 years behind, pedagogically, it's about doing the same thing. And she describes a math lesson where instead of the teacher telling them what the formula for calculating the area of a triangle is, and then having them memorize it, and he's devised a lesson plan that actually has these kids figure it out for themselves.
Right.
I would say more broadly, because I know we're running short on time. So the nuts and bolts that Jonathan is describing, and that I assume the book he mentions describes in greater detail. What I found consistently is that the two things students want from their teachers is that they challenge them and that they care about them. So a way to put that is you set high standards, clear standards, and then you help students meet those standards. Both of those things require time. And again, to me,
and money.
Time and therefore money, because we're talking about faculty resources. And again, to me, sadly, sort of the essential problem of American higher education is the single-minded focus on research as an incentive for faculty performance. I know we're running out of time, but John, I love the certificate thing that the American Council for Undergraduate Education has devised. Our institution is going to require that certificate.
Yeah, look, it's good. This is a long march, and it would be incredibly naive of me to imagine that any of that's going to happen in 6 months' time, But at the same time, right, it does seem to me that as more and more people enter this system, and as more and more people recognize its inadequacies, we were talking about this before the class began. I think that one of the things that I'm hoping that we see more of is, frankly, student protest and resistance around bad teaching. We saw a version of it actually during the pandemic, where at some schools, including mine, there were these petitions to get discounts. Why? Because students were paying for the real thing and they were getting the online gruel.
True.
Well, that's not exactly what I'm talking about, that it's in the same zone. Right? Because the implication behind all that is, look, we deserve a certain standard that we're not meeting, right? Or in this case, not receiving, right? And so I think there you can see a glimmer of it before. And look, like Bill said, also, there's enormous variation in this system, right? In fact, it's not a system at all. We should probably get rid of that word. There are big systems like Bill talks about, sort of cultural systems, but there's no higher ed system. Right? There are 4,000 places to get a BA, and they do vary. But this is going to be my wet blanket side. One of the things that worries me is, frankly, a lot of that variation has been reduced in recent years, as even the liberal arts schools, which used to be called teaching colleges, have put more of an accent on research. Everyone has, in a narcissistic way, their favorite little quote in their book. And mine, Bill may remember this, is from somebody at Colby College, which in the early 90s created a center for teaching and learning, which all these institutions have made, including mine. And one of the graybeards, and I say that advisedly because now I'm a graybeard, but one of the senior faculty, he's commenting on this and something I found in an archive, and he says, a center for teaching and learning. Isn't that what Colby is? You know, and it just summarized so much. These centers for teaching and learning, they're one of these things that prove their opposite. It's like, you know, an advertisement that says authentic Chinese food. Like if it says authentic food, it almost for sure isn't, because if it was authentic, you wouldn't have to call it that. The Centers for Teaching and Learning remind me of that, right? They're an effort, I think, a very good faith one, right, to try to enhance the value of this function. But the very need to do so actually proves how poorly valued it is. That's what's so poignant about the whole story.
So I'm very sorry we have to leave our conversation there. Hope very, very much that the two of you will agree to come back for another discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's see how we can purchase the books. Excellent Sheep by William Deresiewicz. There it is at simonandschuster.com, $18. And The Amateur Hour by John Hopkins University Press. There it is, $34.95.
And it will be out in paper next year, and it will be
Oh,
cheaper.
good.
Inshallah. Yeah. Yeah.
And let's see how we can stay in touch with Bill. Here's his website, billderesiewicz.com. Bill, it's okay if our participants reach out to you?
I urge them to reach out to me.
Fantastic. Okay, so they just click on the contact and it will bring you right to Bill's email. And John, same thing with you. It's your Penn website. People can reach out to you at that email address.
Yes, and also let me just point out, if Bill Deresiewicz's book about Excellent Sheep wasn't depressing enough, he had to follow it up with The Death of the Artist. Yeah, like, yeah, can we get any grimmer? Yeah, yeah.
Fantastic. So that is, billderesiewicz.com, and John's is at his faculty webpage at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
So thank you so very much to Jonathan Zimmerman. Thank you very much to Bill Deresiewicz.
Thanks
My
a lot.
pleasure.
Have a good one.
Simeon. Thanks, John.
Take
So
care.
let's take a look at what we have on Wednesday. Next Wednesday, Del Sol String Quartet. San Francisco's Del Sol String Quartet likes music that asks the question, why not? And that why not may shed light on their pioneering journey outside the comfortable concert hall and into the darkest, most unwelcoming corners of Angel Island, the Ellis Island of the West Coast, a Kafkaesque administrative center formerly responsible for detaining countless would-be immigrants from China by decree of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The quartet will present this and other happier projects that are sure to inspire other string quartets to use, quote unquote, all the world as their stage. Come welcome violinist Sam Weiser and Benjamin Kreif, violist Charlton Lee, and cellist Catherine Bates to our show. As always, all information about upcoming shows can be found at www.simeonmoro.com. So once again, thank you to Bill and thank you to John. Thanks very much to Professor Lino Rivera, and most of all to you, our participants who make it everything worthwhile. From
Thanks
Vienna,
a lot.
Austria, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, from Portland, Oregon, and from the Bay Area, California, goodbye and see you next Wednesday.